I entered foster care before I ever entered a classroom. By the age of 11, I had already lost 2 family members to murder. When it was time to go to school and teachers were asking me to learn and behave, they didn't realize that resentment, abandonment, and grief had already begun to mold me. I remember being at the park when I was young, laughing, running around, just trying to be a kid. My friends would always ask me, "Yo, why you just standing there like that?" I would be frozen, staring into space, mouth wide open. They thought it was funny and would tease me a little bit. What they weren't able to realize was the fact that I was heavily medicated on Concerta, which is a stimulant medication used to treat ADHD. I was forced to take prescriptions I didn't want because adults around me told me it was best for me. "Just trust us," they said, without much acknowledgement of the shame it forced me to carry. I felt silenced in my own body. As I grew older, I learned to express my emotions the only way my environment seemed to understand, through anger. Anger became a form of self-love, a form of protection, a way to defend myself from my community when I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere. My distrust in systems only magnified during my time in school. Nobody ever asked me why I would get angry so fast. My trauma showed up to them as defiance, disruption, and disengagement. My struggles were treated as a behavior problem, and care from my teachers was replaced with punishment. I learned to believe that I was a problem that needed fixing. I lived the school-to-prison pipeline before I knew there was a name for it. And as we can see, facing disciplinary actions while in school increases the risk of involvement in the criminal justice system by over 20%. And those aren't just numbers. Those are real-life representations of thousands of lives that have been negatively impacted by the current structure of our education system. I know I was one of those numbers. By the age of 14, I was searching for a sense of belonging anywhere I could find it. And this exposed me to street culture and peers who were not making the best choices. For almost 5 years, I said no to that life, and I even graduated high school. I said no when it was much easier to say yes. I said no when higher education felt like a foreign concept I couldn't understand. I said no when opportunities were scarce and survival felt immediate. And what society never acknowledged were all those times I had said no. It only responded when I finally said yes. My grandmother passed away when I was 19, and she was the one person who always provided me with a feeling of safety. I ran away from home one time due to an argument I had with my mother, and I went directly to my grandmother's house because I had no idea where else to go. She let me stay there and didn't even tell my mom that I was there. No questions, no judgment, just safety. Everything kind of just fell apart after she had passed. Grief had completely taken over my life. All of that anger now turned into reckless behavior. I was arrested for attempted murder at the age of 22, and I truly believed my life was over. Prison itself didn't change me, but something happened to me inside of prison that changed my entire life. About halfway through my prison sentence, I met Dr. Hillary Binder. Dr. Binder is the executive director and founder of the Tufts University Prison Initiative of Tisch College. TUPIT is a restorative education program which provides individuals access to higher education while incarcerated, as well as a reentry program, which is accessible to anyone with prior system involvement of any kind. TUPIT centers itself on community, healing, and social justice through education. I remember going to my first class, and we did something called a grounding. A grounding is when you close your eyes and you take a few focused breaths to bring yourself into the space. It was a way to kind of forget everything that was going on outside of the classroom. Y'all, I'm not gonna lie, at first it sounded crazy. But I tried it. And when I closed my eyes and listened to the guided meditation that Hillary provided, I truly did not feel like I was in prison for a second. After that first class, something in me just changed. What I found in Tuppet was much more than a traditional education system. It was a community where I finally felt like I actually belonged. Slowly, as I continued taking college classes inside a prison, I found something that I had let go of a long time ago: hope. Due to the advocacy from Dr. Binda and the ability to enroll in college while in prison, my education began to give me the language to understand my pain. My community started to offer me a sense of accountability and support as I began to process it. And when put together, they gave me a future I couldn't yet imagine. Education was no longer a space where my trauma went unseen. However, during my second semester of college, my beliefs were put to the ultimate test. The man who had killed my uncle when I was 11 years old had just arrived at the same prison I was in. I remember finding out when I was still in the school building, during the break of one of my classes. Everything just went silent for a moment. It felt as if time had completely frozen. The image of visiting the scene where my uncle was killed replayed over and over in my head, looking at the broken beer bottle and the blood on the ground, watching all of my family around me falling apart. That was the only day I ever saw my grandmother cry. For years, I promised myself that if I ever met this man, I would hurt him. I wanted to hurt him for taking my uncle away from me. I wanted to hurt him for forcing my 3 cousins to grow up without their dad. But I was no longer the same broken person dealing with that hurt. At the time, I was taking a class on the process of an apology and accountability with Quinn Phillips. I was surrounded by peers and mentors who had walked similar paths, and some who may never get the opportunity of a second chance at freedom again. People who had experienced immense pain and loss, but somehow found the ability to show up and care for others. People who challenged me intellectually. And the advice from my friends was simple: whatever choice I were to make, just stand behind it when I make it home. So I made a choice. I had agreed through a mutual friend to meet this man in the prison yard and give him a chance to tell his side of the story. When my friend pointed him out in the yard, I froze for a second. This was the first time I'd ever even seen this person. A huge part of me was unsure if I was making the right choice by choosing to talk to him. I still had that voice in my head telling me to make it right the way I was used to. When I was walking up to him, we made eye contact, and it looked as if he immediately knew who I was. I'm not sure if he'd seen me prior or if he could just sense my awkward energy. When I got close enough, we nodded our heads and acknowledged each other. He tried to shake my hand, but I had to respectfully decline. We began walking around the track in the yard, and neither one of us spoke for a few moments. Before I could say anything, he immediately started crying. He told me how sorry he was. He told me the story of what happened the night my uncle was killed, how he grew up as a child, and how he found himself in that situation that night. He also told me he pled guilty to a second-degree life sentence so my family did not have to endure a trial. And I had to sit with that for a second. He gave his life away at 18 years old to spare my family further pain. And then I focused on a detail that shifted everything. He was 16 years old the night he killed my uncle. 16. I now realized the school to prison pipeline was not specific to my experiences. It was a systemic failure our nation has quietly embedded in our school systems. Nothing can undo what my uncle lost that day. But this experience forced me to come to terms with something very disheartening. When loss and grief is treated as a burden to educational institutions, they fail to acknowledge and interrupt generational trauma. And when they fail to address this trauma, they don't just fail victims, they produce more of them. This made me reflect about who I was at 16, how broken, angry, and lost I had been. And in that moment, I understood something profound, a concept that I would understand much more intimately in later years due to my interactions with the Transformational Prison Project. For those who aren't aware, TPP is a restorative justice organization founded and facilitated by mostly formerly incarcerated citizens. Their work is centered within the community as well as youth and adult justice systems, and their focus is to facilitate dialogues of accountability, forgiveness, and healing. My first experiences with TPP were through a restorative justice circle about 2 months after I came home. I was in the heart of my reentry struggles. I had just went through a tough breakup. I had almost no money, no job, living in a place I was still learning to be comfortable in. Most of the clothes I had were from donations. I was struggling every single day. That circle taught me that no trauma is small and every feeling is valid. I felt seen, I felt supported, but most importantly, I knew I wasn't alone. Their motto is simple: hurt people, hurt people. And that realization did not erase my pain, but it transformed it. Because I chose forgiveness, a generational cycle of violence and trauma ended in that prison yard. And not because I felt like he deserved it, but because I was realizing myself and our future generations did. Forgiveness, education, and community saved me from myself. It freed me from living up to expectations of violence and chaos just to feel like I belonged somewhere. It allowed me to finally feel like I mattered, not to a gang, not to a system, but to myself. On the day of my release, the only thing I wanted was to go to school. I walked out of prison with $120 and this very pair of sneakers. I used $20 of the only money I had, and I made it to campus my first day home. I immediately knew this was where I belonged. In a short time period, I moved to a new city. I became embedded in the work of Haley House, which is a food justice nonprofit in the South End of Boston focused on building community through food and so much more. I earned my associate's degree soon after coming home. I found meaningful employment. I fixed my credit. I built stability. But most importantly, I established peace. All of this was possible due to a split-second decision to choose not to hurt others just because I have been hurt. And today, although I will never be totally sure if it was the right choice, I take pride in my decision not to retaliate. Forgiveness once meant a sign of weakness, but now it began to symbolize strength and empathy. Trauma began to heal that day, and violence stopped being the answer. These brief moments from my life are proof education and community don't just change outcomes, they save lives. And that's not just a theory. Science shows the more education someone has, the lower their risk of mortality. As a society, if we want to address violence, incarceration, and poor mental health, we have to stop asking what's wrong with you and start asking what happened to you. Unfortunately, teachers with 20 to 30 students in their classrooms can't possibly be attentive to each one. And what I failed to understand then was that my failure was not due to personal lack of ability. It was a result of a wider systemic problem plaguing our society. We must invest more resources into our public school systems as well as higher educational programming for incarcerated individuals. Courtrooms should not be our society's response to trauma. I get to stand here today because somebody invested in my potential instead of my punishment. So this is not about charity, it's about justice, and it begins in our schools. Thank you.